Hey there. So I just finished reading your quizzes for Chapter 7, or from the book so far, and I wanted to create this quick video to sort of go over that quiz with you and those 4 questions. But then there's a larger issue that I think this plays into that I was trying to guide you through with this quiz, and if you haven't gotten that idea yet, I need to put it out there for the rest of your reading, and that is the uncertainty that you're facing with what is real and what is not real. In fact, I think that we will do something this week in which I ask you, are the ghosts really there? What is the argument that can be made that this is real? And what is the argument that can be made that this is in the governess's head? And then I guess the third question is, what is the argument that the kids are playing with the governess? Like, so imagine you had somebody who you know believes in ghosts, and you start banging on doors and stuff to scare them. So which of these things is true? And we have to go back to the fact that, when we were reading the small passages and stories before we got to this novel, we were in the realism unit, and Henry James is a realist. But he also is one of those naturalists that you read about, the very last thing you read before you started this novel, where there were limitations to realism, that we realized that realism has a lot to do with impressionism and point of view, and all those things can be manipulated. Henry James's brother, William James, was a prominent psychologist at the same time that Henry James was this writer. And so Henry James was very much aware of the psychology circling in the 1890s. And also, this is when Freud is starting to perpetuate or show his theories about the unconscious, the aspects of our personality that we aren't really aware of. And much of Freud's work dealt with repressed sexuality, which was very much the case in the Victorian era. But let's get to all that in just a moment. First, let's talk about the quiz. So the first question that I asked you was, how does the governess know that Flora knows? And I've got that in italics. How does she know? So she comes in and she tells that to Mrs. Gross. And I want you to see how literal Miss Gross is. And this is the way that Henry James is characterizing the working class. It's like everything is very literal. So the governess says she knows. And the Miss Gross is, how do you know? How do you know someone knows? Well, if you are literal, you know someone knows because they tell you that they know. But in this case, the governess is basing all of this on inference that Flora had her back turned, that she was playing, and that it got really quiet. And that's how she is sure. So then we go to the next question that I have is, how does she know that the figure was Miss Jessel? Well, guys, the short answer is there's no way she can know. She saw something. She's the only one that saw that person, that she says herself it could have been a person, a townsperson or a groundskeeper or a neighbor. But she decides that it's Miss Jessel. It's a woman in black who is beautiful. And black, by the way, would be black for mourning. And I wonder why, if it is Miss Jessel, was she wearing mourning gear? Like mourning as in paying respects for someone who has died. But she says, again, Miss Gross is very literal. Where? How? How do you know? And let me find the passage. Here we go. That took a second. She says, it's my predecessor, the one who died. And, of course, Miss Gross is dumbfounded. Miss Jessel, how can it be? How can you be sure? And then the governess says, ask Flora. She's sure. And then she says, but I'd no sooner spoken than I caught myself up. No, for God's sakes, don't. She'll say she isn't. She'll lie. There's so much going on in that phrase. One, the surety that Flora will lie. Then the challenge to Miss Gross, which, remember, Miss Gross is in a different social class. Why don't you just ask her yourself? They can't talk to the kids about this because they corrupt the kids by asking the questions. So they if the kids are innocent and they don't know anything, then they're planting ideas in the children's heads that aren't even there yet. So they can't talk about it. But she challenges Mrs. Gross, and they both are like, no, don't say. And then she says, I'm clear that that Flora doesn't want me to know. Again, all of these assumptions are based on the fact that the governess saw something, and she's sure that Flora saw it too. And I guess 99% of the time, if a fire truck drove by my house and I saw it, I'd assume that everybody else saw it as well who was standing there with me. But the ambiguity here is that we don't know if what the governess sees is real. And that's the point of the whole novel as you'll continue reading. So she's sure that Flora saw it because she saw it, which, again, in the real world, if a bird hit the window, we were all in the classroom, we'd all have seen the bird. And then again, Mrs. Gross, so literal, asks questions like, but why? How? Why would she do this? But then I want to get to the how do we know that it is the governess. Here we go. She says it's her predecessor, and Mrs. Gross is like, well, why would the predecessor want to be here? And she says that, she has intentions, and the governess says, well, the intentions are to get her, and that Flora knows it. Guys, all of this is assumption that the governess has made. And then she mentions Mrs. Gross helps to fill in the blanks. The person was in black, you say. And then she says, yes, in mourning, rather poor, almost shabby, but yes, with extraordinary beauty. I now recognized to what I had last, stroke by stroke, brought the victim of my confidence, for she quite visibly weighed this. This is interesting to me, too, because she calls Mrs. Gross a victim of her confidence. The governess is aware that she is manipulating a less educated person. Less educated and also her inferior in terms of class in the employment hierarchy in the house as well. So I think that's important too, that stroke by stroke, she is winning over the Mrs. Gross. She was in mourning and she was beautiful. And then Mrs. Gross says, oh yes, she was beautiful and infamous. And that's when they get into the disgrace. And it's all spoken with so much innuendo that you, the reader, have to fill in the blanks about what does it mean that Quint was a hound? What does it mean that he was too free with everybody, also with the lady? And that led me to the relationship. And let's see. He did what he wished with her, and Miss Gross says, with them all. So this guy, Quint, was really a bad guy. He really felt a lot of confidence and freedom without the uncle around and did whatever he pleased. And then it says here, it must have been what she wished, is what the governess said. Well, she's blaming Miss Jessel. So if Miss Jessel got into a bad relationship, she must have wanted it too. Mrs. Gross' face signified that it had been indeed, and she said at the same time, poor woman, she paid for it. And this leads to the last question that I asked you. What do you think happened to Miss Jessel? Well, she had an inappropriate relationship with Quint. We can guess that much, that the way they are talking in hushed voices, this was a sexual relationship that she had with Quint. And I think that we're not so far removed from the 1890s that when we say that a woman paid for it, how exactly would she have paid for it? And then there is another hint where she says, then you do know what she died of. I asked, no, I know nothing. I wanted not to know. I was glad enough I didn't, and I thanked heaven she was well out of this. And yet you had then your idea of her real reason for leaving? Oh, yes. As to that, she couldn't have stayed. Fancy it here for a governess. And after what I imagine, I still imagine, and what I imagine is dreadful. So some of you wrote that the dreadful thing was that she had an affair with someone lower than her. But that was ongoing. What could have happened that would have made her leave and not continue the affair? And then she says, fancy it here for a governess. Okay, so she paid for it. And there was a reason that she had to leave, and it was unimaginable. How could it be here with a governess? All of those things would lead a reader to conclude that Miss Jessel was pregnant. She had to leave. She left in infamy and sadness, and a lot of you guessed that she committed suicide, and a lot of scholars have guessed that as well. So you're on point there. A lot of people think that the dreadful had to have been that she committed suicide. So Mrs. Gross filled in all that information. But what I want you to understand is that everything that's happening with Flora and Miles, the governess is filling in. Now, in the reading that you're going to do for this week, that you're going to continue with, you're going to see that the children are bad. They do some things. But the question is, are they playing upon, like the children in the classroom with the substitute teacher? Are they playing on her weaknesses? Are they really seeing ghosts and in cahoots with them? Okay. There'll be more videos this week. I've got a lot to share this week.